Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Village Global's Venture Stories. I'm here today joined by a very special guest, Ben Reinhardt. Ben is an independent researcher and hosts the podcast, the Idea Machines podcast, which I'm a big fan of. Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
So Ben, we're here today to talk about innovation, the different ways to fund innovation, cultures that lead to innovation, progress studies, research. There's a lot of topics we want to get into. Sort of by way of introduction, you sort of have an interesting background. As you think about the different experiences you've done or undertaken, especially recently in last 2 years, what is sort of the thread that you've kept on pulling? What's sort of the thread that underlies your curiosity?
Yeah, this is gonna sound a little crass, but like I asked myself that a lot, and eventually it just came down to the fact that like I really want there to be more awesome sci-fi shit. Like at the end of the day, like that's what I want to see in the world, and like I think that there's a lot about everything else, but it's just mostly like how do we get more of that like Star Trek future to happen.
Yeah, and what are the biggest bottlenecks right now? Why don't we have that sci-fi vision?
Well, like if I had a really like sort of like trite podcast length answer to that question, I would be very, very happy. I think at the end of the day, it's extremely complex, and there's no single answer. And there's I think many people, including myself, like trying to answer that question. But yeah. It's like it's I think one thing that I've been looking at is that I think like the theories around it sort of fall into like three buckets. So I could just like tell you the three buckets, and like within those buckets are like this like massive amount of complexity. So one bucket is kind of this idea of I would say like individual incentives, and that bucket is things around like, well, researchers are incentivized to pursue all these things that aren't leading to amazing outcomes. People are like misallocating their labor in different ways. Another bucket is sort of the systemic decay or problem bucket. And this is looking at things like, okay, like what's happened to academia, the decline of R&D labs, everything in there. And then like the third bucket is what I would just call like we've picked all the low-hanging fruit bucket. And that may be, it's sort of like this null hypothesis of like, well, it's just not as easy to build that future as we once thought. And I'm hopeful that bucket is not the correct one, but we will see.
What you don't have in there, unless it is somewhere in there, or what you just didn't mention, is culture.
Yeah, no. So like that's absolutely a good point. I sort of like in my mind, I would put that in like sort of the systems bucket, where like culture is the highest level of the sort of like hierarchical systems. But yeah, like you're absolutely right. And I think that culture may be one of both the most important and hardest to change of all of those pieces.
Yeah. So let's go into the buckets individually. So on the incentives, the first one is that, or the sub buckets underneath that, sort of different funding models, but then also sort of ideas of how you capture value.
So the way I would describe it are just sort of like all the ways that basically it's like the idea that like smart, ambitious people are not spending their time effectively and asking the questions of like, why aren't they doing that? So it's everything. And so let me just preface this with that, like, I'm sort of like trying to present all the different arguments, and like these arguments are not all coherent, and I don't agree with all of them, but it's sort of everything from the arguments around that, like, well, researchers are spending their time going after sort of like really sort of quick to complete tasks that yield papers really quickly and let them get grants really easily. So like Jared Newman had a pretty great article on this called One Process, where he basically argues that what it might be is that you're just seeing like sort of everybody's crowding the really quick to pay off applications. So like that's one example. Another one might be it's like all the smart people are going to work in finance or consulting, right? Like that's another sort of thing that falls into that bucket. So it's like why are people not spending their time making air quotes correctly to get more awesome stuff?
Yeah. What are stabs, or what are some potential solutions or alternatives that you're excited about that either exist or should exist? Or
well, I mean, like, so some of the stuff that you're doing with Village is like really sort of like in the right direction of like, okay, like let's sort of encourage people to use themselves to the fullest potential. So like stuff that you're doing, sort of like what Matt Clifford is doing at EF, and then sort of more broad efforts to try to address like citation obsession among scientists, and just sort of like any of these things that try to address the individual incentives. I think maybe like things like 80,000 hours are other sort of good efforts in this direction.
What is 80,000 hours doing that is effective here?
Well, like, so I actually don't know how effective they're being, like, so, but just in terms of sort of like pushing in the right direction, it's at least asking, like, sort of sounding the call for people to take a step back and think about what they should be spending their time on.
Totally. Yeah, I know that's underrated. I agree. Let's get into venture capital a little bit. You know quite a bit about it. What do you think are sort of the limitations of venture, or how would you like to see venture perhaps evolve, or what's perhaps the right scope of venture? Because I think there's this broader question of, right, like what is the right funding model for certain research or certain science. Yeah.
So I think venture capital was sort of an amazing innovation, right? Like how many awesome things exist because of it. And I'll sort of go through the constraints on venture as I see it. And I want to make it really clear that this is not like, it's not actually a way that the system is broken in any way. It's just sort of like, these are the constraints that people have to operate under, which is, one is like, at the end of the day, as a venture capitalist, you are trying to make money for your LPs. And so the LPs want to make money, and they have many other places that they could put their money, including the stock market. So you basically have to handily beat the much more sort of low risk stock market. So that's one constraint. It's just like you need to have a certain rate of return. Obviously, there's the structure of venture funds where they need to make that return in a certain amount of time, and that just limits the sort of the scope of the projects, right? Where anything that you fund needs to either have an exit or be able to produce some liquidity by the end of the fund, except in like extraordinary circumstances where you can just say like, okay, we'll keep this rolling. And then at the end of the day, it's like, I think venture is like, it needs to fund for-profit companies that are making a product, and those companies, as they should, their goal is to capture as much value as possible, or rather to like capture enough value to make ridiculous returns. And so the things that I worry about venture as a mechanism for funding are things that are just like what I would call just bad investments, right? And that from a return on capital perspective. And these things, they're just some things where they either produce something that it's very hard to capture its value, or there are other things where if you try to capture the value, the total value ends up being much less for that. So like if you imagine that somehow Xerox was able to like really heavily patent the idea of like the mouse and the graphical user interface, I think that the world would be much poorer today for that. Like so like Xerox was unable to capture much of the value that PARC created, and I think that part of the reason it created so much value was because they did not capture it. So those are some of the constraints on VC.
Yeah, and have you seen any interesting solutions to try to sort of innovate on how we capture value, such that the things that are creating a lot of value today that don't capture more of it? Or is the idea that we should get away from just thinking about capturing value in that sense, and motivate people?
Yeah, I mean, so like if we think about the knobs that you have to play with, I think sort of one of the most tunable knobs is like the sort of the time scale, and so you see things like the engine out of MIT, and I believe that they have a 15-year fund, so that's like 50% longer than sort of like most of the longest VC funds, and that hopefully will allow them to invest in projects that other VC funds would not be able to invest in. They're still very early, so we haven't seen results yet. And then another knob is sort of like the returning profit knob. And so there's an organization called I believe the Prime Coalition, and they're a sort of like a non-profit VC fund. And so they get money from foundations, and they promise those foundations that they'll invest the money in companies that are working directly on climate change. And so if they make a return, that's great, but those foundations are not sort of demanding the same level of returns. So those are two of the knobs that I've seen played with well. And then both you all and EF, I guess, are sort of playing with the at what point do you invest knob, right? So most VCs invest in companies, but you all are sort of pioneering in the idea of investing in people before they even do anything. So I guess like those are all like pretty exciting ways that people are playing with the different knobs there.
Yeah, and a couple others I bring up. Clearbank is interesting in that it's basically enabling debt finance easier, or sort of revenue share as opposed to taking away equity for people who are building businesses that are that have product market fit. They don't need to give up equity. It's just a cash flow problem, and
Nice.
So they can sort of pay back. And then also is Indie VC is sort of exploring this model where I don't know exactly what they're doing. I just know that you don't need to shoot for unicorns in their model, and that there's much more. They present much more optionality and have sort of different clauses such that it's not a failure if the founder only sells for $50 million or $100 million if they raise a bunch of money.
Yeah, those are both awesome. I think I haven't paid as much attention to them because I guess the things that I'm focusing on, and this is obviously not the only place to focus, but both of those models do require sort of like a slightly lower risk profile than what normal VCs would take on. And I'm actually interested in sort of like the even higher risk profile, right? Like the stuff that, it's like might not even end up in a product, let alone a profitable product.
Yeah. So what are the homes for those today, and where could, or what could new homes be, or like if you could wave a wand and.
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I think my hypothesis right now is that they don't really have a home. Or at least there's no default home. So in some cases you have a just like super wealthy founder or backer who's sort of like willing to bankroll things until they become. They sort of like the risk decreases enough to become normally venture fundable, right? And that's sort of like Elon Musk's modus operandi, and you see, a lot of very notable billionaires funding different things. So that's one home. Some things fit into sort of the corporate research lab model, right? So I think Google DeepMind is a good example of that. So if like people see the AI version of it, and then like sometimes people like manage to eke them out in university labs, but my concern is like these are really the things that don't have a good home, and so I am trying to figure out like how to build them a home.
Yeah, and let's say the government or somebody gave you sort of no strings attached money to create this home for. Maybe that's the wrong question. Like, what could potential homes look like? What are within the constraints of the real world?
Yeah. That's good. I appreciate the constraints of the real world. Yeah, there's a lot of sort of knobs to play with there. The idea that's really attractive to me and that like I'm actively pursuing is the idea that you could sort of borrow from DARPA's structure and have a sort of like a coordinating mechanism that puts together programs and either by sort of like by hook or by crook gets money from philanthropy or some other sources that I haven't quite figured out yet. And basically, like I guess the hypothesis is if you can a much more clear and precise plan than sort of just like, oh, we'll do some cool stuff. Like if you have a really clear, precise plan, it might be easier to get money. And then also sort of like the idea of an organization that is like a company in that it does sort of like centralized work, but like more like a nonprofit in that it's like not seeking to produce a product. And I realize that this is sort of fuzzy because it's still sort of being made up as we go along. But like that really is the question of it's like how do we bring back or how do we create an environment that is sort of like sits outside the constraints of like academia, corporate R&D, and like for-profit companies. And like that's I think I know that that's the question. I am not sure that I have a great answer yet.
What's the closest thing to that?
Oh boy. So there's a couple of organizations that sort of defy the constraints in different ways. Like so one is I'm sure you know about like the HHMI Genelia campus, which it's like very focused on research but like they don't require people to publish papers while they're there. They're just do some awesome research. They like don't require people to like continually ask for grant money. So they're just like, we'll fund you straight up 5 years, go do that. That's one example. I think there's an organization in San Francisco called Other Lab. They just sort of like work on projects. I believe they're primarily funded by government grants, but the sort of like the umbrella organization takes care of that so that people can just work on stuff. And then recently, Welcome Leap launched that they're sort of like creating a like an ARPA-like structure for pharma. And that was launched like a few months ago. So like I don't think anybody really knows, or at least I don't know very much about what they're doing, but that seems very promising.
I think sometimes is Google like compared to Bell Labs, or like what are sort of the trade-offs between either of those sort of examples?
Yeah, like sort of like Google X versus Bell Labs.
Yeah.
So I think one thing to note about Bell Labs that many people forget is that Bell Labs was not particularly profitable. And there's a fairly compelling argument, I find, that Bell Labs was basically just like chaff to throw off antitrust regulations. So AT&T basically said like, okay, we'll like let anybody use non-telecom related patents from Bell Labs so that we won't get antitrust lawsuits against us. So So one is like just the motivation for Google X versus Bell Labs, I think is different. So like from that top down, like I think Google X has more pressure to produce product basically. And from what I can tell, like talking to a couple of people there, it's not like they don't have a lot of people on staff whose job is just to sort of like sit around and do research. They come up with a project idea, and then they like get some people together, and then they see if it's feasible, and they go do it. And so sort of just like the structure of how projects come about and the requirements that are placed on them is different. And then I think also there's like you mentioned culture earlier. I think this is a cultural difference that has happened in our society and is also true at Google X, where we've really come to embrace this culture of like, like iterate fast, MVP, like get stuff out there that works sort of very well in the software world. But I'm not sure how well it works for like, kind of like paradigm shifts in atom-based technology. And I think that from what I've seen, Google X really does sort of embrace this iterative MVP way of thinking, which is good in some situations, but may not be the best for sort of paradigm shifting research.
Totally. Let's talk about sort of the second bucket more about like system decay. What's happening there? What's most interesting to you? Maybe we start with academia, or we can start elsewhere. But what are sort of the biggest challenges you see?
Yeah. So you've done a ton of work on this, where it almost like goes just back to like institutions in general are across the board running into a lot of problems. And I think specifically in terms of like of research, it's a combination of, I think, too much pressure being put on academia. Like it's expected to not only sort of probe the structure of the universe, but also to produce like cool technology, and basically to like get everything all the way up to the point that you can wrap a C Corp around it and start selling stuff. That's like one really sort of high level systematic problem. But then another, I think, is just like, and to the culture point, like we don't trust institutions anymore. And so I think that to sort of do these projects, it really does require a lot of trust. And because like you're sort of like any paradigm shift as you start it is going to look really stupid. So there's that piece. And then another sort of part of that bucket, I think, that people don't talk about as much generally is just regulation, right? So regulation is very good at creating sort of like paradigmatic lock-in. And it's a little bit insidious because like the goal is to keep people safe and to save lives. But if you look at the regulations that are on the books today, we could never invent like automobiles, for example, right? Because they need to conform to a certain form factor and use a certain set of materials and have a certain safety standard. And so it may be that just like our overuse of regulations is putting too much friction into the system.
Do you see a world in which some of them get unwound, so to speak, or what is sort of the way out on the regulation front?
But I don't know. The problem is that sort of every regulation is there for a good reason, and usually that reason is to keep people safe. I think the issue is that to keep everybody perfectly safe, we would all need to be in like hypoallergenic bubbles and never do anything. But you can't really make that argument, and so it's like it's hard to have a conversation about sort of like safety trade-offs. And I think that this is sort of where the urge of people like the Seasteading Foundation comes from, to be like, okay, we need like a new place that like has like lower regulations. I'm not convinced that that's going to work, but I think like that's where that intuition comes from. But I don't know how concretely we really get there.
Totally. If you could wave a wand and change anything about how the incentives in academia for some of these, the things that we care about, what might that look like?
Oh man, like get rid of peer review. Like so one, get rid of peer review. Two, get rid of sort of the accountability around government grants. Like literally just let the people giving grants be like, hey, like this research looks cool and I'm going to give them money. I think almost like getting rid of departments, because that really constrains people. Like I think breaking the research piece of academia out of the rest of the university seems really promising. And then like making it so that somehow so just to take a step back, so everybody knows, it's like the job of a professor is primarily not doing research. It's primarily like managing research, bringing in money, teaching, doing administration. And so what ends up happening is that like people who are just really good at research and just want to do research end up sort of dropping out of academia. So somehow having sort of like a pure research track in academia that's like just as high status as being a professor, I think. And also just like get rid of all the administration. like just fire all the administrators. I'm sorry to any administrators who are listening to this, but
where is the biggest bottlenecks from in terms of actualizing some of the things that you talked about? Like, is there unlikely to be sort of change from within, and you just have to build alternatives, or how do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think it's one of these like tricky coordination problems. Maybe the biggest bottleneck is that there's really no alternative. So right now it's basically like the question is, when you're doing your PhD, the question is like, do you want to be in academia or do you want to be in industry, where industry is this broad term that encompasses everything from like startups to IBM. And so like maybe the biggest bottleneck is that there's no sort of exit option, right? Like, so there's no way to do the things that people go into academia wanting to do outside of this whole bureaucratic, incentive-laden structure. And I think like maybe one of the another like bottleneck is just the way that money works. And so this, but like any suggestion that involves like government policy change, while this is a single point suggestion, it is unlikely to happen. But like if the government changed the way that they gave out grants, or just like the money that funded research stopped coming from the government, because at the end of the day, we do sort of want the way that the government gives out money to be fair and accountable. But anytime you have a fair and accountable process, there's going to be a lot of paperwork that needs to go along with it, and a lot of due diligence that needs to be done with it. And then that's what, and also you want metrics, right? And so it's like metrics can be gamed. Paperwork and due diligence lead to a lot of bureaucratic overhead. And so we end up where we are. And so it's almost like this fundamental tension around government funding that, like, on the one hand, you want government funding to be fair and accountable. And on the other hand, that demand for fairness and accountability leads to all these other problems.
Yeah. So what do we do?
Yeah. So my one, like, so the first step is just like acknowledging that these wicked problems exist. Like, so step one, I think what we need to do is say like, okay, like these are actually like really tricky problems, but then like optimistically go at them. And then so one thing so that I'm trying to do is just to say like, okay, like what would some kind of structure outside of academia look like that maybe doesn't get its money from the government, is maybe philanthropically funded, and so it like doesn't give out grants, but actually like just goes about creating things in a different way. So that's one thing. And then the other is like going back to the culture point, is like somehow we need to build up, one is just like optimism and like almost just like holding people accountable for like why things are not moving faster, right? So it's like if somehow we literally held everybody in Congress and at the NSF like actually accountable for the fact that we're like not seeing the output that we possibly could, like that could put pressure on people, but just like, yeah, I think it as like culturally wanting like sort of like really seeing like what could be and embracing the fact that the system does not necessarily have to work the way it always has worked, and just sort of like constantly hammering that drum. And I guess the other piece is like so what I'm not actually advocating is like burn it all down and build it up again. Like I think that we don't take a serious enough look at like how do we like make the institutions healthy and trustworthy again, as opposed to like completely going around them.
Well, and that's what it seems that it's a time to build ethos. I feel like is sort of mostly on trying to build new ones, just because it's maybe giving up on existing ones.
Yeah. So it's I think, and I don't know where to come down on this. Like, I think it's really a discussion of like what needs to be rebuilt and what needs to be like maybe like I guess like pruned. We never talk about pruning institutions. What do you think about that? Like just sort of like instead of saying like okay, let's burn it down, like this, there's been some overgrowth. Let's like prune it back and see what grows in its place.
Yeah, it's interesting. In my conversation with Jose, he was talking about, I think it was Jose, maybe it was someone else, the NIH. I think it was the NIH. And basically, he was just saying that our funding mechanisms are just way too centralized, and if we could have more, it is just too big. And if we could have just more decentralized versions, we would have more creativity, more diversity, or more eccentricity in some sense.
Yeah, I would riff on that by saying we want more uncorrelated work, right? So it's like you could have the most decentralized system in the world, but if like everybody in that system sort of has the same incentives, then not that much interesting things will come out. But yeah, I think that would be really helpful. I think the question is, it always goes back to this tension with sort of accountability, right? So it's like I assume there would be some political troubles if like the NIH just like picked 1,000 people like Jose and was like, okay, here's a couple $1 million for you to go fund research, right? However you want.
Yeah, it's like scouts for that. That's interesting. Well, like the Federal Reserve is supposedly like separate from the government, right? In the sense that
supposedly.
Yeah, it's interesting. Is there a government that does this like way better than we do?
I don't think so, honestly. Like I think the issue is partially that like every government basically their research system is modeled on the US for the most part. I think China is really good at sort of the unregulated scale up piece. Actually, related to China and regulations, one thought of that I was thinking the other day is like, apparently this is just anecdotal, but like it usually takes them about 7 years after the introduction of like a new technology, like online peer-to-peer lending, before they regulate it. And so one thing I was wondering is like, what if we just like had a rule that we couldn't regulate any new technology until it's like been out in the wild for 7 years? And this may make people feel really uncomfortable because it's like, oh, like there could be like this just like, self-driving cars like running people over for 7 years. But like that's another way to approach the regulations, where it's like, okay, we'll regulate it, but we need to actually like see what it will do first. That's one thought. But yeah, like China's very good at sort of scaling innovative new systems, and I think at least giving researchers more free reign in certain areas like human genetics. But I haven't seen anything like super super new and interesting come out of their system yet. But there's I don't read Chinese, and so it's like I'm not paying attention to Chinese papers. And two, I think that they've only started to reverse sort of like all the good researchers coming to the US. All countries really do. And also, I guess the last point is that like academia as a system is like pretty international, right? Like all like researchers all over the world are all trying to publish in the same journals and all care about peer review. So it's almost like not even a national level thing.
Totally. One thing you've looked a lot into is sort of the history of our current innovation structures. I'm curious what you've learned that sort of informed how you or evolved how you think about some of these things as you've studied sort of some of the different history.
I mean, let's see. I'm trying to recreate my perception of things when I started versus now. I think one, and Jason Crawford is really good at pointing this out, is that the way that inventions and innovations happen is never as straightforward and linear as we sort of culturally think it is, right? Like, it's like sometimes someone creates something in a lab that then gets commercialized, but sometimes someone just like is tinkering around and they discover a thing, and then people in the lab like go and like help make that thing more efficient. And sometimes it's that someone invents something and then like someone else steals it, and then it goes to a lab, and so like it's just like the process is really messy. That's one thing. I think the other thing is that I've come to appreciate how uncomfortably crackpotty everything really seems. I think we sort of have this narrative that things would be invented inevitably, but I've come to not actually believe that's true. That there's actually like a lot of contingency around whether innovations happen. So that's another thing that I've really sort of changed my mind on.
That's really interesting. When we talked about capturing value a bit earlier and the sort of difference between capturing value and creating value, how strong is the coupling between the two? Or like, are you excited about mechanisms by which we can better align that coupling?
So yes, I am excited about mechanisms that could better align that coupling. However, I think and I don't have a ton of evidence to back this up, but my current belief is that there's only like some things are just bad investments, in that there are just some things that if you like that you just can't capture the value. This happens so much with like tacit knowledge that comes out of a lab, where it's like, who really came up with the thing? We're not really sure. And a reason that I worry about that quite a bit is that I think what you've seen with IP is that you can sort of get into these situations where to like create this amazing thing, you need like 5 pieces of IP, and each of those 5 pieces of IP are all owned by someone different, and none of those universities or companies have the incentive to bundle them together to create something amazing. So you take like Xerox, for example, and they like created the Xerox process. They had 7 years before they even filed IP on it. Like so they weren't worried about that. And like in those 7 years, they managed to create like I think it was a couple of dozen different pieces of IP that all went into the original like Xerox copier machine. And so if you imagine Xerox today, there's no way they would be able to go 7 years without filing IP. And if like the minute they filed for like one piece of the puzzle, then 5 other groups would probably patent all the other pieces of the puzzle. And so it's like, would we even have the Xerox copier? I don't know. So that's all to say that I'm just sort of skeptical that a focus on value capture will actually lead to the most value creation. And it's just like there's these things that have these massive externalities. And it, like one of my pet theories is that as we get more technology, the number of externalities in the world, both positive and negative, has increased. And we all our legal systems and our social systems are sort of like not set up to deal with those. So that's just like an abstract musing about that.
Yeah. Speaking of musings, as a segue, Eric Weinstein's view on tech versus science. I think sometimes he says, tech should be the younger brother of science or something. But what is sort of your perception of that?
Yeah, I don't agree with him. I think that viewpoint is like a very like that came from basically the Manhattan Project, where like that was like sort of like your most beautiful expression of like people discovered some phenomena, like fundamental physical phenomena in a lab, and then they figured out how to harness that, and then they like analyzed the theory and realized that it should be possible to like bring 2 pieces of uranium together to release a massive amount of energy, and then they realized that they could create a bomb out of that, and then they went and did it. So like that's sort of like the classic basic to applied research pipeline. But if you actually look at how like the relationship between science and technology, it's like it is very complicated, right? Like so you look, it's like the counterexample is thermodynamics, right? Where you have some guys and they're like, whoa, if we like heat up the steam, it creates a vacuum and we can create an engine out of it. And then the scientists came along and they're like, whoa, you're like doing this thing. I wonder how that works. And then you create the entire science of thermodynamics because this technology sort of illustrated it. And the way that I've been thinking about this is it's all about like natural phenomena and exploiting natural phenomena. And sometimes we just sort of like discover these phenomena by accident, right? Like, it's like the person's been brewing beer for hundreds of years with like this stick that like they put in the brew and it magically turns into beer. And then, someone comes along with, and like that person has already exploited that phenomena, right? Like they've exploited the phenomena that like yeast creates alcohol and you can use that. And then like someone with a microscope comes along and they're like, oh, like, it's like the reason that you can exploit this is because of this, like this yeast. But then sometimes science does discover the phenomena, like, physicists discover that, it should be possible to create coherent light, and we should be able to exploit this coherent light phenomena to make a thing, and then they go and they make a laser. And so I think it's just that there are many ways to both discover and exploit phenomena, and it's like both science and technology have a role in that. And if you, the listener, are interested, there's an excellent book about this called Cycles of Innovation, of Invention and Discovery, that it like really sort of like details how it's much more of like a cyclic thing than a straight pipeline.
Totally. What did we not cover that you might want to cover?
Yeah, so like you've been sort of tweeting and posting a lot of stuff about liberalism recently, yeah. and I was just really interested in sort of like where your head's at around that, and like what do you see as the sort of like the role of the idea of liberalism today? Because like people talk about liberals, but we don't talk about liberalism very much.
Right. Well, yeah, I think there's a few different aspects to that. So I think the thing that got me excited, sort of interested in this topic, is I started to. Well, one is I read the book Kindly Inquisitors by, I think, Jonathan Rosh, I think is how you pronounce it, and it is just a fascinating book, and really talks about. It was written in 1992, and it sort of it describes but also predicts basically the sort of threat to the credibility of free speech, and even beyond it, like liberal science. And there has been this sort of creeping sort of, some people call it postmodernism, but sort of school of thought that, why is free speech so great? is sort of the question that it asks. And
Yeah.
and I think in the era of social media, when people are sort of getting sort of trolled all the time, or sort of sometimes even bullied, free speech becomes harder to defend when it's used to attack in some ways. We haven't had to have a defense of free speech often before this, in some sense, because it was just sort of taken as a given, partially because it's given us so much. A lot of this sort of civil rights were built off the back of free speech, but sort of newer generations forget that, or never learned it, or don't appreciate it. So one is free speech, but then also there's this broader attack, and even within the universities, on sort of the legitimacy of reason itself, and underneath that, science and math, and maybe 2 + 2 does equal 5, and maybe science is sort of Western, and thus sort of colonialist, and who's to say what's right, and so people used to do all these sorts of terrible things in the name of science. And so I put what I put in liberals. I put sort of, and then there have been attacks on the free markets, for a long time. But the way I bucket liberalism is like, economic liberalism is sort of liberal science, and belief in reason as a way we should sort of like run our society, and then sort of the marketplace of ideas, political liberalism, such that creating space for people to share heterodox views, because some of them might be right and might change the world. So yeah, that explains my interest.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that is under thought about. Like I feel like we sort of stay at this surface level, but we don't really like talk about like, okay, like what's the philosophy behind what we're talking about. And like, yeah, you don't want to get into like, you don't want to waste time with it, but at the same time, it's like it is good to like at least come to some kind of consensus.
Yeah, no, and I think your example of safety earlier, and Jason talks about this too, is that there are trade-offs, and I think we optimize often for safety in a variety of different ways, in terms of like people's feelings. We want them to feel safe and such. Speech is a threat to that, so there's a threat there. There's a threat, obviously with the FDA. It's sort of like the potential experiments we're willing to have if they lead to potential short-term deaths, even though they might save a lot in the long term. And then also just in terms of economics, in terms of we will justify a lot of government intervention into the economy under the auspice of safety, or sort of the short-term, benefit, without sort of seeing or really wrestling with either the hidden costs or just the more medium to long-term costs.
Yeah. So something that I've been thinking about, which is very uncomfortable, and I don't know where to go with it, is that sort of the idea of the like liberal bargain was created in a world that looks very different from the world today. Like humans are still the same, but I think that technology has in many ways sort of like changed how the world works. There's many more externalities, and we like, it's like the people in the 18th century just like literally could not have imagined many of the things that exist today. And so the question is like, how do we resolve those two pieces?
Yeah, that's an interesting question for sure.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer, but I think it's again one of those things that's worth grappling with.
Let me name a person, and I'll see if you have any sort of interesting differences of opinion. Obviously,
okay.
You person a lot, but Jason Crawford.
Yes. So we had an official online debate, and he still has not responded to me. So I've considered myself to have won that one. But basically, we sort of differ on the Thielian question of definite versus indefinite optimism. I'm very much in the sort of like I think that I value planning much more than he does. And I think that sort of like basically like the definite optimist philosophy is valuable and important.
Yeah. How about Jose?
Do I have any significant disagreements with Jose? I think so. So this is probably going to offend many listeners, but like I don't think that longevity and really human centric biology is quite deserves the amount of mind share that it gets in the tech community right now. Like, yes, I really don't want to die, but at the same time, like we're I think not paying attention to so many things. Like we could have like, you know, like giant structures made out of diamond that we use to like launch things into the atmosphere, and we really could have flying cars, and we could have like atomically precise manufacturing. But so I think that it's mostly like I would disagree with him about where we're paying attention in terms of technology.
Yeah. How about Peter Thiel?
Peter Thiel, man. Well, I guess I'm Jewish and he's Christian, so we disagree there. Other than that, man, like from what I'm gonna like out myself, but like I really don't disagree with him too much. I think actually where I might disagree with him, and I'm still trying to figure this out, is like I think that the ideal of the sovereign individual may not be correct in that I think that humans are actually fundamentally not just individuals. Like we really are a little bit of a herd animal. Like I think of it as there's like a spectrum between spiders and bees, and like the sovereign individual view of the world is like the complete spider end. And I think we're like a little bit more towards bees than that. So I would disagree with him about that. Like the individual is the only thing that matters.
Yeah. We started the podcast by talking about why do we not have awesome sci-fi shit? But why do we not have awesome sci-fi?
Why boy. Well, so I think one is like I think we do, right? So like Seven Eves is pretty great. Like a lot of the stuff that Neil Stephenson writes is pretty great. I think the core of that question is like why is the majority of the sci-fi that we have right now kind of like paints a scary or depressing view of the future. And you know, like I think it's a chicken and egg thing where like I think that culturally, to back to your point about culture, our culture is not that optimistic about the future, right? Like we're and this just frustrates me because like we could be, right? Like you can literally choose to be optimistic about the future. Like if you look at the possibilities, then I think it really comes from that. And so it's like, so like the people who are creating sci-fi are just, you know, they're playing to their audience. And so I would blame us, us collectively as people who are consumers of sci-fi for like not demanding more better sci-fi. Oh, and the other thing is that scientists and engineers and economists don't write enough sci-fi. This is another like core complaint I have is that we have bad sci-fi because like the people who are writing sci-fi don't know science. And this is like not meant to rag up, like there are some like very good sci-fi written by non-scientists. But if you look at like the Halcyon days of science fiction, like of the fathers of science fiction, I think it was like most of them had like technical degrees, right? And so there's something about understanding like how science and physics works that allows you to create a sort of coherent vision of what the future could look like that I think makes it much better. Yeah. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, I love that. Any difference of opinion with Tyler Cowen?
Tyler Cowen, yeah, I think Tyler one is. I think maybe I'm a little bit more optimistic than Tyler. He thinks that, you know, it's like he's like, oh yeah, we might go extinct in like 800 years, and I like to think we'll do better than that. I think I also value planning a little bit more than him, and I also have a higher opinion of Szechuan food in Singapore than he does.
That's awesome. Are any thinkers that come to mind that I haven't mentioned that you sort of have a?
I think I might. Can I disagree with you? Would that be fun?
Please.
Okay, so I think I disagree with you about like kind of the purpose of the university. Like we've had some conversations about this, and I think that you lean much more towards the sort of like it is a bundle of services that can be unbundled school of thought. Like that's my understanding of your position, and like I think that there's something sort of like intangible in that bundling that is not quite unbundleable enough.
No, I think that's fair. I think the short answer is we'll find out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and the question is, can it be rebundled in interesting ways, or like is Lambda an unbundling or a rebundling?
Yeah, I would argue that Lambda School is definitely like an unbundling of the sort of like job training aspect of the university, and I would actually say like I think that aspect can be unbundled, right?
Yeah.
Like I don't think that it is core to a university's identity to be job training.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh! I thought of another person I disagree with. So I disagree with Balaji on his. We're all gonna like run away to the cloud, like that Silicon Valley. The next Silicon Valley will be in the cloud. Like I think that is a very legitimate hypothesis for software. I don't. Maybe I'm missing something, but like I don't see how that works for like atom-based technology. Like if you're all, we're like nowhere near the point where you can like build an airplane with other people in virtual reality and have like robots implemented in the world.
Yeah. So you're saying it's not going to happen because we're just nowhere near it.
Yeah, or it's like I think that we're nowhere near being able to like I think that there for atom-based creativity, people will still need to be near each other for a long time.
Yeah. Do you agree with sort of Peter Thiel's sort of view of sort of history, but also the present, in the sense that he says the Google propaganda is that stuff is happening way too fast, and it's either utopian or dystopian. We can argue about that, but you can't argue about how fast it's happening when really in Peter's mind the concern is things are happening too slow.
Yes, I do agree with that, but again, there's nuance. Like some things are happening much too fast, or rather, like I think things in Bitland are happening very fast, but then things in Atom Land are happening much more slowly than they could. And then also even arguably with computers, like yeah, we're like creating lots of cool projects and products, but like the fundamental nature of like how computers work and how we create things with them like really actually hasn't changed that much since the 80s. Jonathan Blow actually has like this amazing talk. Combination of Jonathan Blow's talk and Brett Victor's talks may actually convince you that we're even moving too slowly with computers.
Wow. What's their punchline?
So the punchline of Jonathan Blow's talk is basically that, it's like we have exponentially better hardware. So it's been a while, but like we have exponentially better hardware, but like we're so bad at programming that we just like keep using that hardware to allow ourselves to write shittier and shittier programs. And then the punchline of Brett Victor's talk is that like it's like APIs are dumb, the like modern file system is dumb, and like basically that all sort of the modern computing paradigm is built on top of essentially like hacky grad student projects. And there are we know that there are much better ways to do it, but we don't have a good way of like sort of getting to that different equilibrium.
Yeah. And how do we get back on track in atoms, or the biggest things holding us back in your mind, sort of regulation and then culture? Regulation and
like again, it's how do we get back on track? I think in my mind it's institutional structures, regulation, and culture, but like all of those feed into each other. This is, I mean, all the things feed into each other. So, it's like I'm trying to create a different institutional structure, but then like other people have other ideas for structures. But at the end of the day, I think yeah, it's like everything feeds into everything else, right? So you can't say like it's all downstream of culture. Yeah, so you could snap your finger and like make everybody feel like have the same attitude as we did in like the 1950s, then that might change things. But you can't do. But we had that attitude because we had rapidly advancing technology. But then we had rapidly advancing technology because we had the attitude. So I don't think that there's a straightforward solution.
Yeah. And I wonder how much of the attitudes is influenced by things like, being in a Cold War or being in war, like sort of external threats versus like just once you achieve a certain level of success, you just get, sort of comfortable or a certain level of income inequality starts to change things versus it just being because we're not innovating that much anymore that we're kind of dubious on the whole enterprise.
Yeah. I mean, like, I think the external threat is, or at least maybe not necessarily, like, you could almost frame it less as like an external threat, but like as sort of like a shared goal. Like, yeah. I think that is something that we like really don't have anymore. And it's because even before the Cold War, the U.S. had sort of like the idea of manifest destiny, and like that like it almost seems like hokey now, but like that actually really mattered to people, right? Like it was like, okay, like we are pioneers, like we go and we do stuff, and like it's like you have de Tocqueville talking about that sort of like that attitude, and like that's sort of like pioneering, go like get stuff done attitude. And I think that like sort of having that external narrative, it's like, and I think that we could have that again, but I don't know how to get there, right? Like, so it's like we could have like manifest like human manifest destiny. Like our purpose is to go to the stars, to like learn everything there is to learn about the universe, and to like spread life as far as we can, and basically to do amazing things. Like that is a possible attitude to have, but you can't snap your fingers and have that happen. So I think it's up to people like you and me to just sort of like relentlessly pound this drum of realistic optimism of like, well, it's like, yeah, like there are things that are not great in the world, but they can be better, and we can do that like through building. I don't know. It's like I by analogy, like I like to think about how people in the Middle Ages would build cathedrals that like they would never see the completion of, and their kids would never see the completion of, and like their grandkids maybe would never see the completion of, but like they knew that they were doing it, and like they were doing it for a higher purpose that was their religion, and we don't really have that anymore either. So it's like we need to figure out what that shared purpose we could go after is.
Yeah. And how can you have a shared, or can you have shared, or how can we create shared purpose without having to need a common enemy?
Yeah.
Challenge.
I like to think that it's possible. Maybe not a common enemy, but we could like, this is going to offend so many people, like that we could basically like think of nature as our common opponent, and not in the like we're gonna go kill it way, but in the like if you go back to natural phenomena, like we need like those are like the crown jewels of nature, and like we can like go and like conquer more and more of it, and like any good conquerors, like you actually like want to be nice to the people that you conquer, right? So it's like, I'm not saying like burn down all the forests. You actually want to take care of that. But if you actually like think of it, it's like our goal is to like basically like take over nature and like the very fundamental workings of it. Like that might be able to stand in for a shared enemy.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I don't know, like we do have this sort of nature nirvana cultural thing of natural is always better than unnatural.
Yeah, and I just disagree with that. Like E. coli is natural. Ebola is all natural, but and it's like, and I think it's people like, I think that there is something like, I think that in the beginning, we were really terrible conquerors, right? Like, because we would go and we'd pollute things and we'd cut down the forests, and like we just know how to do it better now. And so we can still like have that, like we are the masters of the world, and we can still like do that without sort of like despoiling everything. Like I think that's a false dichotomy.
Yeah, totally. I wonder if attitudes will evolve at some point in that direction as sort of our technology just gets better and better, or if nature is just really good at marketing.
Yeah. I mean, so here, my hope is that, it's like instead of like these massive shifts that we're talking about, like the things that like we as individuals can do is we can sort of provide hope. We can provide examples. Like, people like to rag on Elon Musk, but what he does do is he fills people with wonder, right? Like you watch like two rockets landing at the same time, and that fills you with wonder. And it's like, I think that if we, it's like a few individuals go and try to create more examples like that sort of at least can provide that sort of like that glimmer of hope where all other lights have gone out, and then like that might possibly be able to get us moving in the right direction. But it's hard, right? It's hard, and it might not work.
Yeah. By the way, there's this Mark Andreessen quote. I think he's quoting someone else. He says something like, someone's asking, but will we be happier in this new world? And he goes, I'm not saying you'll be happy, but you'll be unhappy in new, interesting, and important ways.
Yes. May we all be unhappy in new, interesting, and important ways.
Totally. Yeah. My guest has been Ben Reinhardt. Again, I would highly recommend Idea Machines as a podcast. Ben also has a fascinating blog. Ben, anywhere else you want to point people to?
I love talking to people on Twitter. If you want to chat, just reach out. But yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Erik.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.